Back in 2017, I was living in a quiet town called Elmridge. It's one of those small towns in Oregon where nothing big usually happens. I was 25 back then, trying to make ends meet with a bunch of side jobs. One of those was delivering food for a company called Bite Runner. It didn't pay great, but it was just enough to help with rent, groceries, and gas. At that age, I was still figuring life out, like most people do in their mid-20s. I liked working alone and driving around the quiet streets. I wasn't big on crowds or busy places, which is why I liked Elmridge. It was peaceful, and most folks kept to themselves. I had no idea that one delivery on a stormy night would change everything. It was a Thursday evening, and I remember it clearly because the weather had been awful all day. Thick, dark clouds covered the sky, and a heavy thunderstorm had rolled, and rain poured down like someone turned on a giant shower in the sky. The wind was loud and wild, shaking tree branches and rattling stop signs. Every few minutes lightning would flash, lighting up the roads for a second before everything went dark again. Most people stayed inside during storms like this, so delivery requests were slow. Just when I thought about heading home, a new order popped up on my phone. It was from someone named Rick D, and the drop-off was on the edge of town, right where the forest starts. The place barely made it into the delivery zone. I almost declined it, but I figured the storm might make the tip a little better, so I picked up the food, a bag of burgers and fries, and drove off. The roads were slick with rain, and the thunder kept booming like drums in the sky. I gripped the steering wheel tight and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield wipers. The address took me to a rundown part of Elmridge I'd never really explored before. Eventually, I pulled up to this old 2-story house that looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. The wood on the outside was worn and peeling, and there were no lights on except for one dim porch light flickering above the front door. The trees around the house swayed wildly in the wind, casting long, creepy shadows across the yard. As soon as I parked, I saw a man standing outside on the porch. He wore a heavy coat with layers underneath, like he was dressed for a blizzard instead of just rain. His hood was up, and I couldn't see his face very well, but something about him made my skin crawl. He didn't wave or smile. He just stood, there watching me. I got out of the car, clutching the food bag tight so it wouldn't get soaked, and walked over. As I got closer, I got a better look at him. His eyes were wide and didn't blink much. He had this stiff, strange way of standing, like his body was tense and ready to pounce. "Rick?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. He just stepped closer and reached out for the food. I handed it to him, but then he said, "Hey, you got a few bucks? My truck ran out of gas." Now, I've been asked for money before while delivering. It's not unusual. But something about the way he asked gave me a bad feeling. It wasn't friendly. It was more like a demand. I hesitated, then pulled a $10 bill out of my wallet and handed it to him. "That's all I've got," I said. "Hope it helps." He stared at the money in his hand, then looked back up at me. His face didn't show any thanks. Just disappointment, or maybe frustration. His lips tightened, and his voice got sharper. "This ain't enough. Come on, you can give me 50. I shook my head. "Sorry, man. That's really all I have." For a second, he just stood there, silent. But the look in his eyes, it changed. He looked at me like I was the reason his life was falling apart, like he hated me. My stomach turned, and I suddenly felt cold all over, even with the warm rain dripping down my neck. I took a step back and said, "Anyway, have a good night," trying to sound normal. Then I turned and walked quickly back to my car. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I shut the door, locked it, and pulled away from the house. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror just in case. That's when it happened. Bang! Bang! 2 loud pops rang out behind me, echoing through the empty street. At first I thought it might be fireworks or something falling, but then I felt something hit my car. The whole thing jerked to one side, and the back tire made a horrible, grinding sound. I looked in the mirror and saw him, Rick, standing in the middle of the road with something shiny in his hand. He had a gun. I didn't think. I just hit the gas even though my car was swerving like crazy. The wet road made it worse. The back tire wobbled like it was going to fall off. I could barely keep the car straight and I was terrified it would spin out and crash. I kept driving, gripping the wheel like my life depended on it because it did. My hands were shaking so hard and the rain didn't let up. Thunder cracked above me and the trees on either side of the road blurred as I sped past them. I didn't stop. Not even when I reached town. I drove straight home, parked my car crooked in the driveway and ran inside. I locked every door and window, shut all the blinds, and called the police. They came out later, asked me a bunch of questions, and said they'd look into it. I reported the whole thing to Bite Runner too, but nothing ever came from it. No arrests, no follow-up. It was like Rick D vanished into the storm. My car's tire was busted up real bad. Bullet hole straight through it. If I hadn't driven off when I did, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe he would have tried to stop me, maybe worse. Ever since that night, I don't take any late-night deliveries, especially not during storms. I used to think our little town was safe. I used to believe that working a simple job couldn't get you hurt, but now I know better. Some people don't want food, they want something else. And on nights like that, when the thunder's crashing and the rain won't stop, you have to be real careful about where you go and who's waiting for you. When I was a kid, rainy nights were my favorite, especially the kind with thunder and lightning. Something about them felt exciting, like anything could happen. My little brother, Caleb, felt the same way. We lived in a small town called Pine Brook, and every time it stormed, we'd find ways to turn the bad weather into an adventure. One year, when I was about 10 and Caleb was 8, it started raining hard one Friday evening. We were sitting by the window, watching the rain pour down and the wind shake the trees. Thunder rolled in the distance and flashes of lightning lit up the sky every few seconds. The power flickered once or twice, but it stayed on. We noticed the storm had turned into a full-blown thunderstorm. The streets outside were shiny with rain, and water ran in streams along the gutters. But even with all that, we still wanted to go outside. There was a big hill in Maple Crest Park just a few blocks from our house, and it was perfect for sliding down, though we usually did that in the snow. But the rain made the grass slippery, and we thought, why not? It'd be like sliding on a water ride. We begged our mom to let us go out just for a little while. She gave us that look, the one that said she didn't think it was a great idea. But in the end, she said, "Okay, but only for an hour. And you better wear your raincoats and boots." We got dressed right away, putting on our thickest coats, rubber boots, and even those cheap plastic ponchos we kept in the garage. We grabbed an old plastic sled we had used in the snow last winter, figuring it might work on the wet grass too. By the time we stepped outside, the rain was coming down in sheets and thunder was growling like an angry dog. We held onto the sled together and made our way down the sidewalk, stomping through puddles and laughing like crazy. No one else was out. The whole street looked empty and a little spooky, with flickering porch lights and trees bending in the wind. When we got to the park, it was completely deserted. Maple Crest was usually full of people during the day, families having picnics, kids on bikes, people walking their dogs. But now it was just us, the rain, and the dark sky. The street lights nearby made everything glow orange and weird-looking. We walked to the top of the hill, and even though we were soaked, we were excited. The rain made the grass super slippery. We climbed onto the sled and pushed off. It worked. We slid down the hill fast, yelling the whole way. It was cold and wet and amazing. We laughed and ran back up the hill to do it again. After a few runs, we stopped to catch our breath. That's when I saw someone. At the bottom of the hill, standing near the path, there was a man. He was just standing there in the rain, not moving at all. He wore a long coat that looked heavy and dark, maybe black or brown. I couldn't really tell in the rain and dim light. He had a wide-brimmed hat on, the kind people wear when they don't want to be noticed. His face was hard to see, shadowed by the hat and the way he was facing us. "What's he doing?" Caleb asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. He wasn't walking. He wasn't talking. He was just watching us. We stood at the top of the hill for a minute, hoping he would walk away. But he didn't. He just kept staring. Finally he moved, but not toward us. He walked slowly to the side and sat down on one of the park benches, still facing the hill. Still watching. "I don't like this," Caleb whispered. "Let's go." I agreed. We decided to do one last slide and then head home. As we pushed off, I tried not to look at the man, but I could feel his eyes on us. When we got to the bottom, I glanced his way. He was closer than before. Maybe he had moved when we weren't looking. His face was still hard to see, but something about him made my stomach twist. He didn't look surprised to see us. He didn't smile. He just watched. We grabbed the sled and left the park without saying anything. The rain was falling even harder now, and thunder cracked loudly above us. We didn't talk much on the walk back. Both of us kept glancing over our shoulders, but no one seemed to be following us. When we got home, we peeled off our wet clothes and changed into warm pajamas. Mom had already made some hot cocoa, and we sat on the couch drinking it, trying to forget about the man. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I walked down the hallway toward my room. The rain was still pounding on the windows and the wind howled outside. Lightning lit up the sky, followed by deep, rumbling thunder. I passed the living room window, and something caught my eye. There was someone standing out by the street. I stopped and looked closer. My heart dropped. It was him. The man from the park was now standing across the street from our house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. There in the rain, looking straight at our window. His coat was soaked and his hat dripped water, but he didn't seem to care. I called out for Caleb and he came running. We both stared at the man in silence. Then, after a minute, he turned and slowly walked down the street. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He just disappeared into the night, one slow step at a time until the darkness swallowed him. We never saw him again. We told Mom about it the next morning, but she didn't believe us. She thought we were just trying to scare each other. But Caleb and I knew what we saw. We never went back to Maplecrest Park after dark again. And to this day, whenever it rains and thunder rolls across the sky, I still find myself looking out the window, just to make sure he's not out there watching. A couple of years ago, a guy named Jake had to drive out to a small town called Brentonville for work. He used to do a lot of long drives for his job, so he was pretty used to being on the road for hours. This trip was like any other, just him, his old car, and a quiet highway stretching for miles. But this time, something happened that he never forgot. It was a cold, rainy night. Not just regular rain either. It was one of those nights when the rain hits the windshield so hard you can barely see out and thunder rumbles like a giant growling in the sky. Jake hadn't really looked at the weather before heading out, so he was caught off guard when the storm rolled in. He was about 3 hours into his drive, deep into the countryside, when the wind started to shake his car a bit. The rain came, down harder and harder, and lightning flashed across the sky every few minutes, lighting up the empty road ahead like a camera flash. The sound of thunder crashed a few seconds later, making him jump in his seat every time. The storm was getting worse and fast. The road was slippery and his tires were starting to lose grip. He could feel the car sliding just a little every time he hit the brakes. It wasn't safe to keep driving like that. He decided to get off the road at the next exit and find a place to wait it out. He figured maybe there'd be a gas station, or if he was lucky, a small motel. When he finally reached the exit, all he found was a small truck stop. No hotels, no restaurants, just a quiet old gas station with a few big trucks and a couple of cars parked outside. The place looked kind of rundown, but it was better than nothing. At least it had lights and it wasn't completely deserted. Jake pulled into a parking space near the side of the building. The rain was still pouring, and thunder was shaking the ground every few minutes. It was the kind of night that made everything feel a little scarier, even if nothing was really wrong. He went inside the truck stop to use the bathroom and grab a bottle of water. The place was small and quiet, just a couple of truckers sipping coffee and looking half asleep. After a few minutes, Jake went back out to his car. The rain had already covered his windshield and roof, and everything looked shiny and wet under the flickering streetlights. He climbed into the back seat, grabbed some old blankets from the trunk, and started setting up for the night. He had done this before on long trips: cover the windows with blankets so nobody could see inside, curl up in the back seat, and get a few hours of sleep. As the rain pounded on the roof and thunder rumbled in the distance, Jake wrapped himself up in a blanket and tried to get comfortable. The wind howled outside, and now and then he could hear tree branches scratching across the roof or tapping on the glass. It was creepy, but he was tired and just wanted to sleep. Somehow, despite the noise, he dozed off. But in the middle of the night, something woke him up. At first, he didn't know why he was awake. He lay there in the dark, listening. The windows were still covered with blankets, so he couldn't see anything outside. But he felt something was off. The air felt heavy and his chest was tight with that uneasy feeling you get when you know something's wrong, even if you can't explain why. Then he heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like nails or something sharp sliding across the outside of his car. It started near the driver's door and moved toward the back. Jake held his breath. The noise came again, a little louder this time. Something or someone was outside circling the car. He froze. His heart was pounding. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He just listened as the sound got closer to the driver's side door. Then came a click, the sound of someone trying the handle. Someone was out there trying to open the door. Jake's heart was racing now. His hands were shaking under the blanket and every part of him screamed to stay still. He hoped whoever it was would think the car was empty and just go away. But they didn't. They kept moving, testing each door one by one. Jake could hear the handles being pulled one after the other. Thank God he had locked all the doors before going to sleep. He reached slowly for his phone, trying not to make any noise. It was just after 4:30 in the morning. His thumb hovered over the screen. Should he call the police? But what would he even say? Hi, I think someone's outside my car in the rain. Would they even come all the way out here? Just then, before he could decide, there was a loud bang, right next to his head. Someone had slammed their hand or something hard against the back window. Jake flinched and sat up fast, his heart nearly jumping out of his chest. He didn't wait. He threw off the blanket, climbed into the front seat, and turned on the engine. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, barely keeping up with the rain. He pulled the blanket off the front window just enough to see, and hit the gas. The car slipped and slid as he pulled out of the truck stop, tires spinning on the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw something, a figure, standing near where his car had been. They didn't chase him, but they stood there staring. Jake couldn't see their face or even tell what they looked like. The rain was pouring, and the storm made everything blurry. All he saw was a tall shadow, standing still, watching him drive away. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, about 25 minutes down the road. There he found a small motel with a glowing vacancy sign. The lobby was empty, but a sleepy-looking man at the front desk handed him a key without asking many questions. Jake didn't even bother unpacking. He locked the door, pulled the curtain shut, and sat on the bed for a long time just listening to the rain outside. He never found out who was at that truck stop, or what they wanted. But from that night on, he promised himself something. No, more sleeping in his car. Not during storms, not on quiet roads, and definitely not in places where strangers could sneak up in the dark. Because sometimes, when the rain falls hard and the thunder shakes the ground, it's not just the weather you have to be afraid of.